Alright, I wanted to make a video. This is going to be a controversial subject, and a lot of people are going to ask, why did I even make a video like this? Why even bring up this subject? This is a subject that's mostly been forgotten about. Mostly people, we've forgiven everybody over this. Why open up old wounds? Well, part of the reason is there are still people who believe this, although those people probably won't care what I have to say about it. There are also people who profess that they don't believe this, but maybe want to know more about it. It's historically curious and interesting question, because this is a question that has affected Jewish-Christian relations and been a source of pain for the Jewish community for centuries. And this is the question of Jews responsible for the execution of the one that the Christians today call Jesus. And first of all, we have to find out, is there any historical validity to the texts that they claim? Now, I certainly do not believe that the books that the Christians call the New Testament are part of my Bible, and I don't believe they belong together with my Bible. But I also recognize that, first of all, there's freedom of religion, and it's none of my business what other people do in their own religions. That's first of all. It's not my religion. If you want to become Jewish, I have what to say about what's Judaism and what's not. And if you want to call it Jewish, you can't call that Jewish. It's not Judaism. It's Christianity. It's a different religion. Just like, I would say, to folks who want to call Christianity, something / Judaism, like they call Messianic Judaism, this and that. It's not Judaism, no more than Islam is Christianity. Could a Muslim say, well, Muslims believe Jesus is a prophet, so therefore Islam is a Christianity? Nobody claims that. Nobody says something like that, as far as Islam is concerned. Mostly because, first of all, their views about Jesus are very different than the Christian views. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that they have things that Christians and Jews don't have. They have their book they call the Quran. And also they don't believe, Muslims, they believe that the Bible was given by God, but they believe that the Jews and Christians changed it, which is kind of silly. But that being said, because it was around for hundreds of years, and in the case of the Jewish Bible, thousands of years, long before Muhammad ever showed up on the scene. So to make a claim like that is quite silly. But again, it's not my job to tell Muslims what to believe. If they want to believe that, that's their religion. That's fine. I believe in freedom of religion, and they're free to believe that. A little bit more controversial to some people would be the question of other Christian groups, if they're indeed Christian, or if they fall into some other category. And I won't name names, because those groups do claim to be Christian. There's one in particular that's pretty obvious, because they have extra books. I'm not talking about Coptic Christians who just have more books of the Apocrypha. I'm talking about an American movement, an American religion that, was invented in America, and has another book that they added onto the Bible, although it's separate from the Bible, even according to them. But of course they would self-identify as Christians, but many Christians, even very tolerant Christians, would say, right? They're our neighbors. We love them. We don't have any personal problem with these people. They're wonderful people, very nice people, but they won't recognize them as Christians. Now, since I'm not a Christian, it's not my place to tell them whether or not they're Christians. So if they want to call themselves Christians, it's really not my business. But really, it's just like if Muslims want to call themselves Christians. But if they want to start calling themselves Jewish, that's a whole other thing. It is my business, but again, there's freedom of religion. There are all kinds of false movements that call themselves Judaism that are clearly not Judaism, or they're slightly based on Judaism. They have, and in many ways, these movements have been cause for these other movements to pop up because of that, and because of their widespread acceptance and so forth. That's not really the point of what I'm talking about here. Now, the Jewish scripture, which, which is accepted by Christians, they call it the Old Testament. I don't consider it old, I consider it totally current. Has many repetitive instances. First of all, within the same book, like this is not really repetition per se, but within, say, the book of Exodus, you'll have the commandments of how to build a tabernacle, and then you'll have the narrative of how they did it, which just repeats what they did. Or in the book of Numbers, you'll have the 12 princes offering their offerings in Numbers 6 and 7, and then which are repetitive. They're all bringing the same thing. That's one thing. But then you'll have certain repetitive things that are indeed slightly different. Or you'll have things which seem to be contradictory. And there was a great deal of work in Jewish tradition in working these things out. Many people say that, for example, it was a question in the Talmud as to whether the book of Ezekiel belongs in the Bible, because it seems to contradict things in the Torah, and the prophets can never contradict the Torah. It was a whole work to not to fit the Torah into Ezekiel, but to fit Ezekiel into the Torah, and so therefore Ezekiel was accepted as canon, and also wasn't hidden away. We see repetitions. Many things that are recorded in the Book of Kings are repeated in the Book of Chronicles, and also are repeated. There are certain passages that are repeated in Isaiah and Jeremiah from the Book of Kings. And sometimes there are slight differences in the narratives, and the question is this a contradiction? And the answer generally is the variances are mutually exclusive. You'll also have things like how things seem to be out of order that will cause people to think, well, maybe there was more than one author to a passage that had only one author. So, for example, according to our tradition, and that's what I believe with all my heart, that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were the true Word of God. They're absolutely 100%. No questions. And so then the question would be, why is it that in the first 2 chapters of Genesis you go through the 7 days of creation and then you go back to the 6th day? Why didn't you just put the 6th day there? And so some people claim there were 2 different authors, and that there were 4 authors to the Pentateuch. And of course that's heresy. And the simple answer is, you have it even today in America. You write a newspaper article, you have an introductory paragraph, and then a second paragraph that goes into more details, and that's just what God did in Genesis. It's not evidence of multiple authorship. Now the difference is, though, what the Christians call the Gospels, they admit have 4 different authors. That's not a question. Of course, the secular scholars will say that most likely the traditionally ascribed authors are not the actual authors, but they say that about our books too. It's not really fair for me to say. It's none of my business, really. I really don't care if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if they did or if they didn't. My point of view, and most scholars will say that whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts, and that's well known. And so people will say that Luke wrote Acts as it's attributed traditionally. I think it's even in the text, if I remember. It was a long time since I've been through that. But the thing is, there are many things that are mutually exclusive, and there are many authors who talk about that. It's not my point. That's why I personally don't accept those books as scriptural. I wouldn't anyway. It's not really, especially since they contradict what's in the Torah, even though they claim that they don't. Even, he says he didn't come to take away the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them, and whoever takes away even the jot or tittle in law and prophets is least in the kingdom of heaven. But he's guilty of that very thing, so I don't know. I guess he's very humble. I don't know. He saw himself as least in the kingdom of heaven. I don't know. I don't mean to be disrespectful. I just want, and really I shouldn't even say something like that, because I have a lot of respect for, even though we have different religions, I have a lot of respect for Christianity because they brought a lot of good things to the world. But I'm just explaining why I'm not a Christian, and I've read through their Bible, and it's very interesting. It certainly gives insights into what Jewish life was like in those days. It's not necessarily historically accurate, but it's fascinating to me, even though a lot of people say one should not even read it. Many rabbis have done so for various reasons. And that being said, the big question is, who holds this responsibility for the execution of the main character of those 4 books that they call the Gospels? And we have a very interesting narrative there, that this fellow was taken to a priestly court. Sometimes it's called by a name that we use, the Sanhedrin, and they condemn him to death, and there are different accounts of the story, 4 different accounts, and then finally he's turned over to the Romans to be executed, and no less than the high priest himself saw fit to condemn him. A high priest named Caiaphas put down the decree, judgment, and since at the time the Jews didn't have capital punishment, they turned him over to the Romans. Now, and even at one point they turned to the people and asked, we're going to pardon one of these people. Who should we pardon? This man here, or someone else, who was a bandit? And they said, no, execute this one, and his blood will be on us and our children. And Pontius Pilate washes his hands. He says he has nothing to do with this, and it's very dramatic, and it seems to play all the blame, take the blame away from the Romans who actually did this, and lay all the blame on the Jews. So it looks very damning. So first of all, as many people point out, it wasn't everybody. The whole nation wasn't there. It was whoever was gathered there that day, even if it was hundreds of people. And they say it's on us and on our children. I didn't accept anything like that. I wouldn't have condemned it. I wouldn't have handed him over for several reasons. Not because necessarily I supported his ministry or anything, yes or no. That's really has nothing to do with the question. The first issue is that the Jewish law makes it very clear that there's a very grave sin we call Masira. You can't turn someone over, an innocent person over, or even a guilty person, really, it would seem in some cases, unless they're an actual physical threat, you shouldn't turn them over to authorities, and certainly not to be killed. If maybe you turn them over to be arrested, it's a different story. If they're a threat to the community, if they're murderers or they're, rapists or something like that, then you turn them over. But if they're if someone like this, let's say even you want to say that what he did was blasphemy, you would never turn over a blasphemer to the Roman authorities. That would violate Jewish law. It's not their job. They have no right in Jewish law to execute such a person. They might have a right to arrest him, but why would they care? All right, do you want to say he's marred b'malchus? Maybe. Again, what's going on here? It would be totally against Jewish law to do something like this. So then why'd they do it? Wasn't this the Supreme Court of the rabbis, the priests, and this and that? Here's, excuse the pun, the crux of the issue here. It was the priests, but it was not the rabbis. What's the difference? This is the real crux of the matter. And this is really the point of why I'm making this video. Who are the priests? Even today in Judaism, we have priests. You might not know that. You think only Catholics have priests. Well, other religions also call their leaders priests. So, what does it mean the Jews have priests? You get ordained as a priest? No. In Judaism, you're born as a priest. It's a sort of an aristocracy. It's only someone who was born, that his father was a priest, and his father was a priest, going all the way, father to son, directly back to Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was the first high priest under the Sinai covenant, the Mosaic covenant. So, accidents of birth do not guarantee piety, scholarship, erudition. They are just accidents of birth. So you have many priests who study and live pious lives, who are worthy of the priesthood and live up to their responsibilities that they were born into. But you have just as many, if not more, who don't. Now, the thing is it's not necessarily father to the son, because if the mother was not worthy to marry a priest according to the laws we find in Leviticus, then the child is not a priest. But if she is, the child's born a priest. My great-grandfather was a priest, but that's my mother's father. So I'm not a priest because it doesn't go through the mother. So I am a descendant of Aaron. I can trace my lineage back to Aaron, the high priest, but I'm not a priest myself because it's on my mother's side and her mother's side, for that matter. And that's just how it is. But you have to know something else. You would assume the priest, and certainly the high priest, that's like the Pope, right? That should be the holiest person in Judaism, the high priest. And it should be. That's what it's supposed to be. But was it? Absolutely not. Not in the time of the Second Temple, and certainly not in the time of the Roman occupation. There were times in the Second Temple when we had great high priests. Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, one of the first high priests in the Second Temple times. He was from the last generation who saw the prophets. he was a holy man. He deserved his title, Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, Simon the Righteous. I prayed at his tomb once in Jerusalem. But the Talmud tells us the high priest's job was for their whole life. And the most important job, perhaps the high priest, what we read in this week's Torah portion, perhaps that's the reason why it's worthwhile to talk about this now, was on Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, on the Day of Atonement, was the only person, a whole year, only one time a year, could go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to the Holy of Holies in the temple, and earlier in the tabernacle. And no one else a whole year could ever enter into the place, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was. And in the Second Temple times, there was no Ark of the Covenant, so it was just the place where it used to be. And that's it. That was the job of the high priest. Now, in addition to many other jobs. Now, but that was the most dramatic position, the high priest. Now, the interesting, fascinating thing was, what if you have to be really holy to go into the Holy of Holies, right? You would assume, right? What happens if you weren't and you went in? No one else can go in there and get you, because no one else is allowed to go in there. What if God struck you down while you were in there? Who would take you out? So they actually, just in case, they would tie a rope around. I've heard even many Christians are familiar with this. It's from the Talmud. I remember I was listening to a Christian radio show, and there was a call-in show, and someone asked, this has to be 20 years ago. They asked, where is the source that the high priest had a rope around him to drag him out in case he died? And he said it's a good tradition. He didn't want to say it's from the Talmud. He didn't want to admit to that. I was already frum. I heard that, and I was already in yeshiva, I remember, and I thought it was funny, because he had to differentiate between a good tradition and a bad tradition. So he said it was a good tradition. It's from the Talmud. But there's more to that story. The Talmud tells us in Yuma, in the tractate that talks about Yom Kippur. It says like this: in the first temple, the high priests would generally assume the position of a high priest at a very young age, and they'd live long lives. And so, in the hundreds of years that the first temple existed, they only had a few dozen high priests. They all were blessed in general with long lives. They weren't all totally perfect. There were some flawed high priests in the first temple. We know that. The Bible tells us that. But in general, they were pretty good people. And most of them were excellent, great people. What about the second temple? Again, like we said, there was Simon the Just, very great. There was Yochanan and Matisyahu. There were the Maccabees, the early Maccabees, the early Hasmonean high priests. Were great people, holy people. But who else was there? There was Yehoshua Kohen Gadol, mentioned in the book of Zechariah and Zechariah. There was Joshua the high priest, also great man. There were great high priests, but most of them. What is this guy doing? It's a 30-mile. So what's going on here? In the second temple, who appointed the high priest? We have in the Talmud a mention of someone, Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. was one of the most erudite scholars, who taught very deep subjects in the Talmud, some of the most difficult passages in the Talmud to understand, laws of purity, and he was such a great scholar in those matters, and he was also a very pious man. He was called the Vice High Priests. Now, what does it mean, Vice High Priests? If you have a vice president and the president is gone, vice president becomes the president. What's this Vice High Priests? If the high priest dies, shouldn't he become the high priest? Well, the Romans understood that this position, the high priest, that's a very valuable position. They can just have anybody doing that, and they certainly don't want a pious, holy man doing that, because they want to have influence on the nation. They want to control these people. They can't have an honest man there. They need one of their own corrupt politicians to be the high priest. And so every year, the high priest, the Romans would appoint a high priest. And he would come to and serve as a high priest, and he would come into the Kodesh HaKodashim, he would come to the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and he would die because he wasn't worthy of that position of the high priest. And so Rabbi Hanina would have to come and finish the job, and yet he didn't even bother asking. After a certain point, the Romans, he would just he knew they were going to appoint one of their boys. All right, someone who's a priest. And many of the priests were Sadducees. They were from a group that did not believe in the teachings of the rabbis. They were heretics. And these people were generally the aristocrats of their society. They were wealthy people, and those were, and many of them, most of the priesthood in Second Temple era belonged to the Sadducee party. It's kind of sad, you see. Now, the Tzaddukim. Oh, Sally, what are you doing? Alright, so I gotta open the window so you can get out. So, the question is, so the high priest was from this group, this heretical group who were sellouts to the Romans. And that's all the high priests were in that time, especially that close to the destruction. So we don't have any record in our tradition of the names of most of these high priests. The record of the high priest Caiaphas, although there have been archaeological excavations that mention him. But this guy, he was not a holy man. He was not a good guy. He was a traitor. He was an evil, evil, evil man. And just because he had the title of a high priest, that in a way just made it worse, because he was not worthy of that very lofty and holy title, but neither were most of his brethren who had served. But what about the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin was the court of the rabbis. The rabbis were the ones who declared. Now, why would someone who hates the rabbis, the high priest Caiaphas, take him to the rabbis? No. The Sadducees actually had their own Sanhedrin. And this is mentioned in the Talmud, that there's the Bezdin Shel Kohanim. There was a court of the priests, and this is what it actually says in the Christian scriptures. That he took him to the house of the high priest, he took him to the priests. It doesn't say he took him to the scribes and Pharisees. It says he took him to the priests, meaning he took him to the Sadducees. And it was the Sadducees, who no longer exist, by the way. No Jews today are descended from the Sadducees. This group totally disappeared when the temple was destroyed, and they totally got assimilated into Roman culture, because once there was no more temple, they had no religion anymore. Their whole religion was just the temple. So therefore, the priests, the so-called Sanhedrin, and the Jews, who, according to the Christian scripture, I'm not saying this is necessarily true or not, because it might be a fictionalized story. I think it most likely is. Although it's quite possible now, when we hear the whole story here about the Sadducees being behind us, and the Sadducees wanted to stay in the good graces of the Romans, and the Sadducees didn't want any upstart rebels, didn't want someone to come and claim to be the king. They already had a king. They had a Herodian king. They had, there was a line of the Herodian kings that went till the temple was destroyed, who were mostly wicked until Agrippas, who was a righteous. He was the last king, even though he wasn't really worthy to the title by his lineage. He was a good man, and he did many mitzvos. And the rabbi said, "You're our brother," even. Because he cried when he realized that he really wasn't worthy to be the king. Although some people frown upon the rabbis having done that. But the point that I want to bring here is that those Jews, those priests, that so-called phony Sanhedrin, kangaroo court Sanhedrin, that if the story is indeed historically accurate, which it might be or might not be, although the fact that it would be the Sadducees would answer the reason why they violated Jewish law in this, because they didn't follow Jewish law. They were Sadducees, they were heretics. These people were not only heretics, but they were traitors to the Jewish people. They were wicked people. We have nothing to do with them. Our community totally disavows all of those people who condemned him, and probably many other Jews who were doing some upstart. He wasn't the only one that the Romans killed. If the story is even true, it might be based loosely on a few other stories and things. There are many things that are possible. But the point, what I'm saying, is that absolutely the Jews today have no connection and no respect, and absolutely condemn those Jews, at least the pious Jews, totally condemn those who turned over anyone, whether it's Jesus or any other Jew, turned over to the Romans. It's absolutely, on one hand, first of all, just the act itself is repulsive, but more than that, those people were traitors, were evil, were wicked people who are seen throughout the Talmud as the utmost villains, and no blame should be placed on the head of today's rabbinical Jews, and that's basically the point that I want to say. For just that reason, about how these priests, these high priests, and this phony kangaroo head are not what they were supposed to be. Alright, God bless. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching. Bye.